Welcome to Ditch Auto Unlocking Manual Photography. My name is Jared, and today I want to talk about the focus option on your camera. Now, I have in front of me a Canon 5D Mark III and a Sony a7 II. Now, I'm mostly going to talk about the Canon 5D Mark III and the concept of using the back button to focus as opposed to using the shutter. You know how when you kind of gently press down the shutter, your camera wants to focus. I have actually turned off that option, and I did that a long time ago, and I'll explain why in a second. I have yet to do that on the Sony simply because the lens that I'm shooting with mostly on this camera has a specific button that allows for me to have both options without disabling anything. So to give you an idea, when you press down the shutter part way, not all the way, your camera focuses. We're most commonly used to using that to kind of focus on whatever object it is. But when you have focus and you want your camera to take pictures quickly and not have to think about refocusing every time you push the button down, you want something to be able to override that. You don't want your camera to have to think and try and refocus on something that you know is not moving. Well, Sony on this particular lens, their 70-200 full frame lens, put these buttons, and these buttons basically kill autofocus. So say you're framed up and you have a picture that you're about ready to take. You take that picture and maybe you're wanting to take a bunch of photos of that. Prime example for me would be the kiss moment at the end of a wedding ceremony. I want to take a lot of photos of that because it typically happens kind of fast, and if you miss an opportune, like a good moment, you might end up with some awkward type of moment instead and not have captured that. So I usually rattle off a ton of photos in that moment. So not having my camera autofocus every time definitely helps with that process. So with this camera, I would simply frame up my shot and focus and then hold down the button on the lens barrel, which would disable autofocus, and then I can just fire away. I mean, I can hold down the button, and usually on the cameras, when you're rapid firing, when you're holding down the button and continuously shooting, it's not really searching much anyways. But if the lighting situation is challenging, or your camera for whatever reason decides to focus on something else, you can lose that moment. So on this camera, just because this lens has that function, I don't have to disable this and use back button and reassign one of these buttons on the back of my camera to do focus. So that's something that's new for me. Now, years ago, I disabled the ability for the shutter button to pre-focus whenever I need my camera to focus. Now, this is good for me because I would use this button on the back of my camera, the AF on button, on this specific camera to focus for me. So when I frame up a shot, I use the back button to focus, and then I take the photo. So it's kind of adds another step into the process of capturing a photo, but for me, I've gotten it down to where it just works out really well for me, and I never miss a shot. I never have shots out of focus because I use the back button focus, and if I accidentally rest my finger on the shutter, not pushing it down all the way to take a picture, but rest my finger on the shutter a little bit, it doesn't refocus and mess up my focus. This even means that if I'm stationary taking photos of something, I can lower my camera, come back up, keep shooting. As long as I'm not adjusting the distance that I am between my subject, I'm not having to worry about refocusing. Whereas the camera would want to do that if I had that option enabled. So on my Canon cameras, that's one of the first things I always disable. It does make it frustrating for anybody else that wants to use your camera, though. I always have to explain this to people if I have assistants using my cameras, or when we're shooting video, and if any of my video guys want to go into photo mode and try to use that as an option, it just doesn't work. And then if you are anywhere else and you have just a regular person who doesn't know much about cameras anyways, take a picture for you, which there's been occurrences where my wife and I have been places and I've had my 5D and I've said, oh, can you take a picture of us really quick? And I hand them the camera and I have to explain, okay, now you have to hit this button, you got to do this. And the photo always turns out horrible. Like I always have to focus the camera for them and just say, okay, point it at us and take a picture. Most of the time, I just end up setting my camera on something and turning the timer on. So there's a little bit of frustration there in the fact that you're really turning your camera into something that's unusable by most other people. But for me, it saved me a lot of times where things have happened. I've been shooting a wedding and during that kiss moment, which is extremely important as a wedding photographer, I'm taking photos and then the groom will dip the bride and I'm moving my camera, which my camera would be like, why are we moving? I've got to autofocus or I need to refocus. And I don't want it to do that because it's not really changing much. I'm just kind of going up and down a little bit. It's not changing the distance of my focal range. So I don't need it to do that. And I could potentially have missed the moment if the camera decided I'm going to focus on the officiant that's behind them. Then they'd be out of focus. And so it's just too risky for me in instances like that where it's kind of a do or die moment. Like you need to capture those shots and they need to be tack sharp. And if they're not, then I would have failed in that moment. So each camera is different when turning on and off that feature. In the Canon 5D Mark III, it's different than when I had the Mark II. It's different than the 6D. It's different than the 70D. All the cameras have different options for this. So you're gonna need to Google search how to do that on your camera. Now I have a tutorial on how to do it on this camera and I'll link to that below the video. But for your specific camera, if you don't have the 5D Mark III, you're gonna need to Google search how to enable back button focus or disable autofocus. It's easy to set this up in each camera. It's just different for each camera. So check out the tutorial that I linked to underneath this video just to kind of give you an idea of how to do it, and you'll probably be able to figure out how to do it in your own camera just simply by following along with my tutorial on the Canon. Now on the Sony, I haven't even bothered looking on how to disable back button focus yet because most of the time I'm shooting with this lens and I have that option right on the barrel. It's also really easy to change focus settings in the camera using custom function button because the Sony has so many of those. So I haven't disabled that feature on my Sony yet, simply for the lens reason. However, Canon doesn't have any options like that. The only way that you could get around disabling and going back button focus would be to get really good at using your autofocus manual focus switch on the side of your lenses, where you focus on the subject, hit that switch, and then take the pictures. But for me, you've got to really pay attention to that switch, and if your thumb's not on the switch, you can't autofocus, or you might be in manual, or you're stuck. There's just too many things at risk. I like having the back button where I have my thumb rested on it nicely, my index finger on the shutter, and I could just shoot at will. And then even with this grip, the AF on button is on the back of my camera and the shutter button is here too. So I have access to both of those features of the camera very easily. And there's just, for me, I haven't missed. Ever since I started using this back button focus, there haven't been any opportunities where I've missed focus, outside of the lighting being so low my camera couldn't even focus in anyways. So definitely something to think about if you find yourself missing focus on subjects or objects or whatever it is you're taking pictures of because your camera seems to kind of search around. Disable that so that your shutter button has one purpose, and that's to take the picture, and then the button on the back of your camera, you can either, if you have the AF on button on your camera, great, that's what that button does, or you can remap one of the other buttons to handle your autofocus, which on some of the older cameras you have to do that. And some of I think on the 70D I had to do that as well. But nonetheless, it works. It works for me, and it could work for you if you're having that problem. Obviously, if it's not an issue for you, if you're shooting landscapes or whatever else, it's probably not as big of an issue. But I thought I'd talk about it anyways because it's a subject that comes up, and it's even a subject on my blog that's gotten a lot of comments. And so there it is. Back button focus on your camera. Is it good for you? Maybe. Check out the tutorial linked below on how to enable that on the Canon 5D Mark III. And if you can't find your camera and how to do this, shoot me a message either through my website, in the Facebook group, or online anywhere where you can contact me, and I'll try and help you find that specific location on how to disable back button, or how to enable back button focus and disable shutter pre-focus on your camera. Thanks for checking out this week's episode of the Ditch Auto Podcast. Make sure to head on over to our YouTube channel and subscribe. You can also get the podcast there, whether you're watching this in iTunes or on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel because it gets you updates whenever we release new videos. And it's not just this podcast, it's also reviews and other product tutorials on camera gear and stuff like that as well, outside of the podcast. So lots of cool stuff. Make sure to head on over there and subscribe. And we'll see you next time on the Ditch Auto Podcast.